Hello, class. I wanted to, at the beginning of the second part of our project one, the rhetorical analysis essay, I wanted to take a second to talk about how to determine who stakeholders are in a public debate or in a topic, and how to analyze them. Because at the center of the rhetorical analysis essay is you deciding which stakeholder you want to focus on. Uh, and the reason we want to focus on specific stakeholders is because for the goal of this part of the project is that your team working individually on these rhetorical analyses will gain a greater sense of what is going on with the public debate. It's easier to enter into and make change in the world if we know where our audience is standing. And if we're trying to enter a public debate, our audience is all those other people that are still paying attention to that debate. So the goal here is, with the assignment, is for you to look into what one stakeholder is saying about the debate and how they're speaking about the debate in different examples of text that they're using. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But I wanted to take some time here at the beginning so that you guys can get a look at this. After you've seen this video or this lecture, take a look at your stakeholders if you've already met as a team and have a list, or if you're about to make a list. Use this as a kind of way to understand how to find good stakeholders that are worthy of investigating for this rhetorical analysis. So we'll talk about it more and more as the time goes on, but I wanted to start there. So the other thing I want to say before I really get it going is this. Typically I've been talking about Black Lives Matter as an example for Project One, but I wanted to switch to something a little more lighthearted because a lot of you are dealing with serious topics, serious debates in your groups or in your teams. So I wanted to give you guys a little bit something that's still important. Okay, it's still a controversy and a debate worth having, but it's not life or death, and it's not about health or anything like that. So we're going to talk, instead of talking about Black Lives Matter today, we're going to talk about the depiction of women in movies. All right. Excuse me. So, of the top 5 box office or grossing films of this year, only one of them features a female protagonist or a woman that's in a lead role. Okay, you have women as characters in a lot of these films, but only one where the woman is a lead role. And even that is an animated film for children in which the lead character is a little bit of a ditz. So the depiction of women in Hollywood is something that has been a conversation for decades. A lot of concerns about stereotypical roles for women being the only way that they're looked at. So a woman is either a mother figure, whether that's a champion mother figure that's working towards a cause, or someone that's just taking care of people, or they're a sexual object, something to be lusted after. Okay, to put it not too fine a point on it. And even regardless of the genre or whatever, these tend to be the stereotypical roles that women are given. And so it's something that people that study film and people in the film industry have been trying to understand and trying to fix. It's a debate, it's a controversy both in the modern America, but also in the film industry itself. So we're going to talk a little bit about this, but if you get lost in the weeds, just send me a question and I'll be happy to explain where I'm going with this. But what we want to do in trying to understand what's going on with this debate and where it stands and who is involved is to start with a stakeholder analysis, or start trying to figure out first who the stakeholders are. All right. So our principal stakeholders, when we're talking about women in the depiction of women in movies, are the first 4 that come to my mind, at least, are the studios, okay, the producers and studio executives that are deciding what films to make. All right, the audience, who's going to see these films, the actresses, okay, depicting these roles, whether they are at the center of the movie or on the margins, okay, and then the directors, because they're deciding how to tell the story. So these are you know, we might talk about a specific film, but we might talk about in movies in general. And these are the first or the primary stakeholders that I'm going to look at. All right. But, and I'm sure you could guess this, these are not very coherent groups, right? The stakeholders you want to look at, a stakeholder is, let me start there. A stakeholder is someone or a person, a group, or an organization. Okay, so it can be those three things. Oh, there you go. But a stakeholder is someone or a group that has an opinion about this topic and has voiced that opinion. Okay, or, and the other side of this, is affected by that opinion, by the outcome of this debate. So if this debate ever gets resolved about how we want to treat women in film, then these people will be affected. So the actresses, yeah, they'll be affected. If women in media stays in this kind of box where they're stereotypically one way or another, then you have these actresses forced to play these similar roles over and over again. All right. If you have the audience is definitely affected. If you kind of expand the role of women and the kind of roles that they play, then the audience is definitely going to see a broader variety of films. Do they like that? Do they not like that? Okay, you can look into it if you chose this topic. The studios care because they want money. All right, let's keep it simple for them. There are other things involved, but they also one of the primary goals is money. And do women-centered movies, or movies where women are given more complicated characters, are they making as much money? Okay, there's been research into that, so we can talk about that. But what are the studios saying about this? So it's just something to consider. But as I'm sure you could guess, these primary stakeholders are not as simple as that. They're not clearly going to have a unified opinion on this. So what you're looking at here are starting points for understanding who our stakeholders are, because there's going to be a lot of different opinions about who the audience is, okay, or who the directors are. So for instance, if I'm looking at this and I want to talk about it in terms of directors, female directors are going to have a very different view of the way that women are depicted in film versus male directors, okay? Excuse me. So of course, my favorite example is Michael Bruckheimer is often criticized for having glamorized depictions of women. For instance, it's an older movie now, but it's one of my favorite examples. In the movie Con Air, one of the few women characters is supposed to be at least 3 to 4 months pregnant, but she has a six-pack. Okay. That is that's something that a male director is going to overlook for the sake of the beauty of the film or whatever else, and a female director is not. Okay, at 4 months you might not have a full belly, but you're not going to be toting a six-pack and having an extremely flat stomach. So these are two different ways of looking at it. So these directors will have two different opinions. Different studios will also have different opinions on this subject. So for instance, Disney is appealing to a younger audience and their parents, so children and their parents. So they are going to have a different opinion about women, how women are treated, or how girls are treated in their films or in their television shows. Marvel Studios, they are a division of Disney, but they are they're those giant action movies, right? Well, action movies tend to be dominated by men. So the roles that women are given in this, are they going to be complete characters? Or are they going to be stereotypes? Okay. And then Focus Features, I don't even know if Focus Features is still around. They tend to focus on more artsy films. So there's more of a lean towards complicated women. Okay. So for instance, some of the big films that Focus Features has done has been a biopic of Queen Elizabeth, and they've also done an adaptation of Anna Karenina, which is, and I probably just butchered that name, which is a Russian novel that features a woman as the lead protagonist. So you have these different studios having this different take on this issue. Okay. You also have different audiences. You have your general audience, which a lot of people will think of first, but as we talked about before with rhetorical analysis, general audience only gets you so far. Most texts are written with a target audience in mind. Even if that's a very broad target audience, they're thinking about who that general audience is, and it's very narrowed in. Okay. Or if we go into the specific genres, audience for a romantic comedy movie is looking for something very different in the way women are depicted than an audience of an action movie. Okay. Or, like I said with Disney, children's movies. Okay. And then we also, and this is how we keep getting more and more stakeholders. If you just start questioning what these different stakeholders are trying to do and start expanding it out based off of that questioning. So, for instance, and I'll go back real quick. If I look at actors or actresses, okay, if I look at actresses, what do they want? They want better roles, right? But some actresses, especially younger ones, are going to not really speak out on that. And their opinion might be something that they keep sheltered because they are trying to get a role. Or if they're young and they look good, then maybe they want to be in that action movie as a starting point for a career, whereas someone that's a little bit older, more established, is not going to want that. They're going to want more complicated roles. So for instance, if I look at actresses, then I have established actors or actresses. They're going to have an opinion. They're going to be saying something. For instance, Meryl Streep has spoken out vociferously about the lack of women critics and how that tailors the way women are treated. Okay, but film critics are predominantly male or men, and so without women writing about film, what happens? Okay, you also have critical actors or people that aren't necessarily established, or maybe they are, but they are speaking out. Okay, so there are a number of actresses that do not keep their opinions to themselves at all. And so they're invested in this. And then, of course, you have your young actors. All right. And then, oop, my fault. I did not mean to go all the way back. And then this is if we just look at those first four things that came to mind. But if I then bring in other people that might have an opinion, then we get even more stakeholders. So, for instance, I'm sorry, I keep coughing. For instance, these media studies, gender studies, gender equality groups, these are people that are interested in the way that women are depicted, not just in film, but in a whole lot of media. And they are studying the way that women are depicted, or they're studying the way that women are minimized or stereotyped in these films. Okay, so you want to include them because they have a say in this. They will speak out about it, but they also, what will happen when this is decided will really impact the way that media studies looks at things. Okay, they'll be impacted by this. And then if I take this even further, then you have, and if you can't see this, the PowerPoint is online. You can look at it there. I look at film critics and film historians and film studies people that are looking just at the genre of film, not at media, but at the genre of film. They're going to be impacted by this. Okay, film critics are going to be really interested in what happens with the depiction of women. All right, especially if, as I said about Meryl Streep, especially if these film critics are women. All right. So what you want to do when you have a list like this, that's super complicated and like spread out in this huge like web of stakeholders, the best thing to do is to try to narrow in on principal stakeholders, or those that are directly impacted and are involved in every step of the way. So as I already mentioned, stakeholders are those who would be affected by the topic or those who have spoken up about this topic. All right, and if you look at your book, you'll see all these people that would be affected by the presence of guns in UK classrooms. Okay, these are all the people, and this isn't even a complete list of all the people that would be affected by a debate about the depiction of women in the media, or in movies rather. Okay, so that's a really large group to look at. So instead, what's better is to look at the fewer primary stakeholders. Okay, so those people that has spoken up consistently about a topic. So they're not just adding their 2 cents and walking away. They are responding and engaging in the debate. They are doing a lot of back and forth. Okay, you have those who are profoundly affected by the topic. All right, so for instance, if we look at this list, who is profoundly affected by this topic? It's a question you might ask yourself. Who is going to, their lives would be changed depending on the outcome of the debate, or depending on if the debate was ever resolved, what would happen? Okay, and so I mean profoundly, not like, oh, for instance, audience, romantic movie comedy audiences are not going to be profoundly affected. They just might be watching different films. Okay, and you might also look at those who are acutely aware of their perspective or their role in the topic. So those that are aware that they should have an opinion, not just those that have an opinion, but those that know they need to have an opinion and are speaking out. Okay, so that's a way to kind of distinguish between primary or principal. I meant to change this, but principal stakeholders or primary stakeholders are the same thing. So those that are really involved in the debate. So if we look at our list, okay, we can see that there are about 5, there are probably about 6 or 7 primary or principal stakeholders. Okay, so you have, and I'll just bounce this down. You have the Marvel Studios. Why are they a primary or principal stakeholder? Because if you demand more complicated roles for women, then action movies are going to change drastically. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but Kevin Feige has kind of been more consistently involved in this debate than a lot of studios, and Kevin Feige's the head of Marvel Studios. You have film critics. Why? Because they kind of determine what films are worthy of paying attention to and kind of track what films are doing. They're going to be constantly involved in this question. Children movie audiences, well, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but Gina Davis, who was a big actress in the 90s, now she's less so. She's in the new Exorcist TV show. But she has an institute for gender studies called Gina Davis Institute for Gender and Media. But her primary reason, the reason she started the institute, was because she noticed that on children's television programming, there are not a lot of women. There's like 1 or 2, but in the extras behind the scenes or in group stuff on there, you don't see a lot of women or a lot of girls in children's movies. And so she's trying to raise awareness for that. Why? Because if you see that disparity as in all the movies as you're growing up, then you're going to think it's normal. Okay, the disparity between complicated characters being men or women. You have the critically engaged actors. You have the female directors. They're going to be super influenced by this role, and then gender equality groups. Okay, now this is still a pretty broad look. Okay, we're still looking at a lot of different types of stakeholders, and they have a lot to say. This is still very complicated, and the goal of the rhetorical analysis essay is for you to find a stakeholder and then look at what they have to say about the issue. Well, you're going to have critical actors that have a whole bunch of different opinions on this. You're going to have female directors that think that the way that movies are done right now are okay, versus female directors that are really troubled by the fact that they can't get a film made that features a more honest look at the way women act towards each other, that sort of thing. All right. So one way to do this, to help yourself, is to find primary stakeholders, is to narrow your topic. Okay, to find a more specific stasis claim that people are discussing or debating. Now, I asked you guys to think about this in your team meeting, but this is something that will help you overall. Okay, so you have this big, broad project, but what might actually help out is to narrow in on one part of that project. Okay, so for instance, instead of talking about the depiction of women in movies in a huge way, I'm going to talk about it in terms of the Bechdel test. And I mentioned this in one of the earlier lectures, but I want to go into a little more depth about this. So the Bechdel test, and I'll just go ahead and show you this, was there's a cartoonist, and I've already forgotten her first name. Anyways, her last name is Bechdel. And she wrote an online comic for a while called Dykes You Should Know. But she came up with this kind of easy way of gauging whether or not a film gives an honest perspective of women. Okay, so you can see here, you have the comic here, but this is basically the way the rules are set up. Okay, I only go to a movie if it satisfies 3 basic requirements. 1, it has to have at least 2 women in it. You'd be surprised to know how many movies have 1 woman. All right, and when we say 2 women in it, I mean characters, not just background actors or whatever. Who 2 talk to each other. So rule number 1, it has to have 2 women, and 2, they have to talk to each other, so they can't be like separated by men, okay? But they have to talk to each other, all right? And 3, they talk to each other about something other than a man, all right? So they're talking about something other than the men that they're dating or the men that they're interested in or that sort of thing. So what does this mean? Well, it's a way to complicate our understanding of women. And instead of talking about the depiction of women in movies, I'm talking about the depiction of female relationships or women women in relationships in movies. Okay. So if I'm doing this, and you can see here it eliminates this Bechdel test. Eliminates a lot of media. If you're only going to watch these type of movies, then it eliminates a lot of movies that you might otherwise watch. For instance, and this is probably dated for you guys, but Sex and the City was this huge show on HBO that featured 4 female leads, and they just, they were there to support each other or whatever. But the primary discussion and the major thing that they talked about was men. They sometimes talked about shopping, but they primarily talked about men. And this went on for 7 years, I think. It was a long-running series, and it doesn't pass the Bechdel test. And so, this is a movie or a show that had 2 movies aimed at women, but it still doesn't show these women talking about anything other than men, or looking good for men, or something along those lines. So you see this in a lot of different media, and so it's an interesting way to complicate this. Anyways, the Bechdel test has caused quite a controversy in media studies, in film studies, because some people say that it is too limiting. Some people say that it doesn't capture the main issue, and some people say that it is missing a lot of extra stuff that should be included if you're going to judge whether or not women are depicted well in a film. And you can see, I'm sorry, they keep jumping back and forth. You can see that in this tag to the end of the cartoon, where the woman that introduced the test mentions that the last thing she was able to see was Alien, because they talked to each other about the monster, not because they talked about something that was important to their lives or something like that. They were talking about the monster, but it still passes the Bechdel test. So when we're looking at this, then we can still look at our 5 principal stakeholders and how they look at the Bechdel test, okay? But I'm going to bring in a more specific audience, because I can look for what these stakeholders have said about this smaller issue, all right, this smaller stasis claim. So for instance, instead of talking about Marvel Studios, here I'm talking about Kevin Feige, and he's the lead of Marvel Studios, and what he has to say about this issue, about the fact that women are either all by themselves. Okay, think about the Avengers. You do have a woman in there, right? But in both of the Avengers movies, that woman speaks to men, but doesn't speak to the other women characters, the smaller women characters in the movie. All right. and there might not be any romance, but they don't talk to each other about anything. So Kevin Feige has some opinions on this, especially if you look at the larger Marvel universe. You have film critics, and I'll talk about them in a second, but you have the audience's reaction to Frozen. All right, huge reaction to this movie. Is that because it features two sisters trying to figure something out between themselves, and the romantic parts of that children's movie are kind of minimized in favor of the strong female relationship? Or is it something else? So one way to look at this and see what's going on with this debate is to see what audiences' reactions to Frozen are. So reviews on Amazon or fanfic and that sort of thing that comes from audience that looks at this world of Frozen. Okay, you can also look at what Jessica Chastain had to say about her role in Zero Dark 30, which is a role that I'm pretty sure it passes the Bechdel test, but what's more important about that movie, and if you don't know the movie, Zero Dark 30 is about the raid from SEAL Team 6 to assassinate Osama bin Laden. Jessica Chastain plays the central intelligence officer that finds out where Osama is. So with this, it passes the Bechdel test, but what's important about this is the central role of a female intelligence officer as an intelligence officer, not as a woman. And so to boil it down to this can cause some problems. So looking at what Jessica Chastain says about her role and what she says about the Bechdel test will help us understand what her opinion is, and by comparison, I guess, other critical actresses, other actresses that are critical of this debate or entering into this debate. Nora Ephron is often attacked by the Bechdel test because of some of the movies she has, like When Harry Met Sally and that sort of thing. But she also passes the Bechdel test, and so there's a complication of what's going on here, and whether or not this test is a good measure of gender equality in film. Okay, and then I already mentioned the Gina Davis Institute. All right. And the Gina Davis Institute is more interested not in passing this Bechdel test, not in showing good equality in terms of the way that characters relate to each other, but is more interested in just more roles. Okay, so one of the big things that they're working on right now is expanding the amount of women that are that are hired as extras in the background of movies, especially action movies, because a lot of them, you might have one featured extra that's like gets a close up in their reaction, but that's a woman, but you don't have a lot of women in the back milling around behind the scene. And it's a small thing, but that's what they're kind of focused on. So if we look at the film critics and trying to understand our principal stakeholders in their criticism of the Bechdel test, sorry about that. We will look at who all is involved in this. What are some of the people, the actual people that are film critics that are contributing to this debate? Okay, so I might look at each of these critics on their own, but I might look at them as a whole and try to get a sense of this stakeholder position, the film critic stakeholder position. Okay, so we have a couple here. We have the Sphinx Theatre Group, which is a group in London that is working to broaden the way that the roles that women play in theater, as a way to complicate their roles and challenge the Bechdel test, because it has a lot more with the Sphinx Theatre Group uses a lot more trans actors and actresses and has a lot more challenging discussions in the plays that they put on that sit right on the line of what the Bechdel test is asking for, as a way to question and push at what that test tries to do. You have Andy Ziesler, We Were Feminists Once, which talks again about the complication, and Andy's criticism of the Bechdel test is that it is being used now as a way to say, is this film feminist or not? Does this film depict women in a good way? But That's not exactly what it's doing, because you miss a lot if you talk about it in terms of just whether or not women are talking to each other, not about men. Okay, and then Walt Hickey talks about how this is not a great statistical measure of equality, because he works for 538, which, if you know anything about, is a huge statistics website or group. And Walt Hickey has analyzed the Bechdel test application and says it's not a great measure of equality because it misses a lot of things, just like Andy says. But Walt is also pointing out that it's still the best we have because it's the only one we have numbers for. And so statistically, this works. He just wishes we could complicate it more. Okay. So I've gone on a little bit, but the basic idea here is that once you find a stakeholder, a principal stakeholder, you can ask these questions, and these are in your book. What does the stakeholder value? What is its priorities? Okay. What kind of text does the stakeholder use to make his case? All right. And what does the stakeholder argue about this debate? So if I look at film critics, what do they value? How do I characterize them? They prioritize well-made films that fit a defined standard. And we've already talked about this. We know what an evaluative argument is. These critics are doing evaluative arguments, and they're trying to determine what is a good feminist film or what is a good depiction of gender equality and what is bad. And that's what a critic does. They try to figure out this according to a specific standard. And so that's what they're doing. They're prioritizing well-made films that fit a defined standard. The rhetoric, as far as how they talk out or speak out about this issue, they write film reviews and editorial columns for entertainment news venues. So they're writing these columns specifically to people in the industry or people that are interested in the industry, because you're not going to pick up Entertainment Weekly unless you want to read Entertainment Weekly. But they're still speaking to an engaged audience, and they're writing film reviews and that sort of thing. And so it might be useful if I'm trying to figure out what they think about the Bechdel test to look at some of their film reviews and to look at some of their editorial columns and try to get a sense of what's going on there. And to figure this out, you just ask these questions. You just ask these questions of yourself, of your stakeholder, okay? And if you don't know, you can ask me or you can ask your other team members, and they might be able to help you out. Okay, what kind of text does the stakeholder use to make his case? Well, an audience is not going to have much in terms of text unless you count buying film ticket or buying tickets to the theater. That'll work. And like I mentioned, reviews on Amazon, that sort of thing. But if we look at more specific stakeholders, we can get a better sense of what's going on. So Kevin Feige, he's one guy. This is a group of people. This is one guy. What does he do? He prioritizes profit because he's the head of a movie studio and a faithful depiction of source material. That's how he got the job, is that he was willing to sacrifice some profit to faithfulness to the material. In his pushback, he was a producer on Ben Affleck's failed Daredevil movie about a decade ago, and he pushed back on that, and that's how Stan Lee was like, "Okay, I'm going to put you in charge of Marvel Studios." And he has some experience and that sort of thing, but he was pushing back on the way they were treating that storyline in Daredevil as a way to stay faithful to the depiction of some material. You can look at his rhetoric. Well, he produces blockbuster films. He has final say on the film. The director might put together a cut, but as the studio, he can recut a movie so that it fits what he wants. So you can look at his films and say a lot about what he thinks about this issue. So that just involves some literary analysis, if you've done any of that in high school or here at UK, and speaks in press releases and interviews. So he talks about these sorts of issues or about the way women are treated in his films or whatever in press releases and interviews. So we can get a sense through that of what he's interested in and what his take is on the Bechdel test. So when we're looking at, and I'm going to try to wrap this up real quick, when you're looking at the rhetorical analysis essay, this is what you're asked to do. Find a stakeholder, okay? Find a stakeholder, see what they prioritize, okay? And look at their rhetoric and see how they argue that, okay? And if you don't know how to characterize them, then look at their rhetoric, and that'll help you characterize them. Because what we're trying to get from this is a sense of who is speaking on the debate and what are they saying and how are they saying it. Okay? And in fact, if you look here, you can see this rhetorical analysis will investigate how your stakeholder talks about the controversy, not just what their position is or where they enter the public debate. So you want to talk about how. And we'll talk more about that in the lecture coming up later on this week. But you want to look at how, but first you need to know who your stakeholder is. And that's what today was about. And I hope this has helped. But again, if you have any questions, please let me know. Next time, we're going to talk a lot about the rhetorical situation again as a way to look at rhetorical analysis. But I hope this has helped. Make sure to do your reading. Look into the rhetorical analysis part. And if you have any questions about that reading, I'm happy to answer them. And if you have any questions about this, please let me know. Make sure you meet with your group and make sure you keep up with the discussion posts. And I will get back to you with your pitch grade, the grades on your pitch presentation as soon as possible. Okay. Have a good day and take care.